That concludes all of the amendments to this committee print. The vote now comes on the amendment in the nature of a substitute as amended. All those in favor of the amendment in the nature of a substitute as amended will say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed, no.
No.
The ayes have it.
Mr. Chairman, on that, I would ask for a roll call vote.
You want to do that on the sure
On this title.
Sure. Well, why don't we do it on the final passage
Yeah.
of the title? So this is the first vote. The vote we're taking now is adopting the amendment in the nature of a substitute. The next vote will be to report out that title, and we will proceed to a roll call vote. But all those in favor of the amendment in the nature of a substitute have vote aye. No.
Aye.
I think the noes have it.
I think the noes have it, but if the gentleman will permit by unanimous consent, we will vote on the final passage of the title and consider and we'll have a roll call vote on the final passage, and we'll consider the amendment in the nature of a substitute as amended, adopted by the committee. Without objection, that will be the order. Now the vote comes on reporting out the title as amended, and the clerk will call the vote.
Mr. Waxman.
Aye.
Mr. Waxman votes aye. Mr. Dingle. Aye. Mr. Dingle votes aye. Mr. Markey.
Aye.
Mr. Markey votes aye. Mr. Boucher. Mr. Pallone. Aye. Mr. Pallone votes aye. Mr. Gordon. Aye. Mr. Gordon votes aye. Mr. Rush. Aye. Mr. Rush votes aye. Ms. Eshue. Ms. Eshue votes aye. Mr. Stupak. Mr. Stupak votes aye. Mr. Engel. Mr. Engel votes aye. Mr. Green. Mr. Green votes aye. Ms. DeGette. Ms. DeGette votes aye. Mrs. Capps. Mrs. Capps, aye. Mr. Doyle. Mr. Doyle, aye. Ms. Harmon. Ms. Schakowsky. Ms. Schakowsky, aye. Mr. Gonzalez. Mr. Gonzalez, aye. Mr. Inslee. Mr. Inslee, aye. Ms. Baldwin. Ms. Baldwin, aye. Mr. Ross. Mr. Ross, aye. Mr. Weiner. Mr. Weiner, aye. Mr. Matheson. Mr. Butterfield. Mr. Butterfield, aye. Mr. Mellison. Mr. Mellison, aye. Mr. Barrow. Mr. Barrow, aye. Mr. Hill. Mr. Hill, aye. Ms. Matsui. Ms. Matsui, aye. Mrs. Christensen. Mrs. Christensen, aye. Ms. Castor. Ms. Castor, aye. Mr. Sarbanes. Mr. Sarbanes, aye. Mr. Murphy of Connecticut. Mr. Murphy of Connecticut, aye. Mr. Space. Mr. Space, aye. Mr. McNerney. Mr. McNerney, aye. Ms. Sutton. Ms. Sutton, aye. Mr. Braley. Mr. Braley, aye. Mr. Welch. Mr. Welch, aye. Mr. Barton. Mr. Barton, no. Mr. Hall. Mr. Hall, no. Mr. Upton. Mr. Stearns. Mr. Deal. Mr. Deal, aye. Mr. Whitfield. Mr. Whitfield, aye. Mr. Shimkus. Mr. Shattuck. Mr. Shattuck, no. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Blunt, no. Mr. Boyer. Mr. Boyer passes. Mr. Radonovich. Mr. Radonovich, no. Mr. Pitts. Mr. Pitts, no. Ms. Bono Mack. Ms. Bono Mack, no. Mr. Walden. Mr. Walden, no. Mr. Terry. Mr. Terry, no. Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers, no. Mrs. Myrick. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Murphy of Pennsylvania. Mr. Murphy of Pennsylvania, no. Mr. Burgess. No. Mr. Burgess, no. Ms. Blackburn. Mr. Gingrey. Mr. Gingrey, no. Mr. Scalise? Mr. Scalise, no. Mr. Boyer is off, pass, and on, no.
Mr. Deal? Deal.
Mr. Deal is off, aye, and on, no.
Mr. Whitfield?
Mr. Whitfield, off, aye, and on, no.
Any other member wish to be recognized? Ms. Harmon?
Ms. Harmon votes aye.
Have all members responded to the roll? Clerk will tabulate the votes and report them.
On that vote, Mr. Chairman, the ayes were 34 and the nays were 17.
34 ayes, 17 noes. The committee print is adopted. The chair now calls up committee print.
Mr. Chairman?
Who seeks recognition? Mr. Shadegg?
Yeah, point of personal privilege.
Gentleman will state his point of personal privilege.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, as was acknowledged, the committee is under some pressure to get its work done today. I guess both sides agreed to a 2-hour limit on each section. Our staff's worked on many amendments, some of which are simply technical in nature. Some of the amendments to this title, which I chose not to offer for reasons of time to allow other members to offer their amendments, are in fact just technical in nature. If the ranking member is correct, it is your intention to prepare a committee mark. I guess the purpose of my question is...
You mean a manager's amendment?
And a manager's amendment. Would you be willing to consider technical amendments which are not substantive, but which would clarify, at least to review them, for possible consideration in that mark?
The chair would certainly be willing to consider any technical amendments if there's no substantive objection to them, and there is a manager's amendment, which I hope we'll have the opportunity to present. We will incorporate them.
Since I'm probably not the only one in that category, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Martin?
Yeah, my understanding of the time agreement on this title, on the health title, in total, we have a total of 6 hours. Is that correct?
Well, we have the health sections divided into 3 titles.
Each title has 2 hours.
And each one has 2 hours.
So in total, we have 6 more hours.
We have 6 more hours.
Would it be, I know of at least 31 Republican amendments.
To all of the health bills.
To all of them.
Health title.
Would it be helpful if we could have a brief 10-minute caucus and let your side caucus see how many amendments you have and let my side caucus, so perhaps we could get time agreements, which are the most important amendments to be debated, so that we might facilitate this, so that some of us might catch planes home to our districts? Well, but they need to be debated. Some of them, I mean, they're...
Before you get into discussion on whether you do it in block or not, that's certainly one of the options you can look at. You want a caucus, we'll recess for 10 minutes.
I'm just asking. I'm not...
No, we'll recess for 10
Yeah,
minutes. You want
let me get my guys together for
Okay.
10 minutes and your guys together for 10
We recess for 10 minutes.